Welcome back to part 3 of lesson 6. We turn now from the Viking invasions to the reforms and changes which occur within Celtic Christianity in this period. The first of which is the Celli Dei. The name Celli Dei is derived from the Latin servus Dei, meaning servant, companion, or client of God. There is a question whether this is truly a reform or rather a shift in focus. The movement recognizes the general tendency for original ideas to become clouded and compromised over time. Christian monasticism has a history of implementing reforms for fresh vision and practice within new circumstances. Native reforming monastic movements were active in Ireland during the 8th and 9th centuries, and also to some degree in Wales, Scotland, and England. The Celli Dei were not a monastic order unto themselves, but rather worked within regular monasteries. The spirituality of the Celli Dei was a strict asceticism while avoiding excess. The emphasis was placed on the sacrament of confession, specifically the relationship between the practitioner and their amkara or soul friend, the one who would hear confession, prescribe penitence, and accompany individuals on a spiritual journey. Note here that the emphasis is on the personal dimension of spirituality. As such, the Celli Dei also provided ministry to the lay community. They also discouraged peregrinatio, and rather encouraged monastic stability, perhaps due to the influence of continental Benedictine monastic order. The rule of the Celli Dei is written by Melruin of Tala. We turn now from this first reform of Celtic Christianity to the second. In order to properly understand the second reform, we need to back up and take a look at the political situation in the Isles at this time. In England, we see the rule of Danelaw come into effect in the late 9th century. Danelaw refers to the area of Danish rule in northern and eastern England from the late 9th to the mid-10th centuries. On the map presented here, you can see exactly where Danelaw would have been applicable. Danelaw was set up through a set of treatises between English King Alfred and the Danish warlord Guthrum in the late 9th century. It should be noted that Guthrum himself is a Christian, and Danelaw ended when Eric Bloodaxe was driven out in 984, and the throne was later returned to the English under Edward the Confessor. Roughly 50 years after Eric Bloodaxe is driven out, Canute the Great comes to England. During his lifetime, Canute was the king of Denmark, England, Norway, and parts of Sweden. In 1015, he invades England with 200 longships. His army soon conquers, or was joined by various groups of Anglo-Saxons, Norse kings, and warlords already living in England. 1 year later, a peace treaty is signed with Edmund II, who retains Wessex, while Canute takes the rest of England. Canute protects England from the Viking raids, bringing prosperity to the land, and is generally regarded as a positive influence to England as a whole. Seen here is the territory that Canute holds during his lifetime. After the reign of Canute, the Normand and Anglo-Norman invasions occur in England and Ireland. These Normans, or Norsemen, were descendants of the Vikings who settled in and integrated into Normandy, which is in the north of France. They had adopted Christianity and spoke French. Under William the Conqueror, the Normans invaded England in 1066 in the Battle of Hastings. William defeats the last Anglo-Saxon king of England and takes the throne. He is crowned King of England in 1066. The story of William the Conqueror is the subject matter of the famous Bayeux Tapestry, made in the 1070s in Normandy. Note on the left-hand side the figure of William the Conqueror himself. Here is another image from the same tapestry. Note the detail and workmanship which went into this tapestry. After William the Conqueror comes Henry II, Duke of Normandy, King of England, who annexes or kicks out the Church in Ireland. In 1154, Henry succeeds to the English throne. A year later, Pope Adrian IV, who is also an Anglo-Norman, consents to the English invasion of Ireland for reform purposes. So we see here where politics and Celtic Christianity meet, in the successive invasions of England, and now the push into Ireland. During this time, the Archbishop of Canterbury claims jurisdiction over the Irish Church. Roughly 15 years later, Richard de Clare, or Strongbow, who is a Welsh Norman, invades Ireland at the behest of Dermot MacMurrough, the exiled King of Leinster. 2 years later, Henry II arrives in Ireland in person, secures Norman allegiance, and summons the Second Synod of Cashel. This leads to the Second Reform of Celtic Christianity, or the Gregorian Reform. This reform was named for Pope Gregory VII and included resolutions on questions which we saw in Part 2 as being problematic for the Irish Church, specifically rules of investiture, or the appointment of church officials, the securing of papal power, or freedom from the secular ruler's control, rules against simony, or the paying or selling of church positions, and against clerical marriage. This establishes a firm rule for the priestly celibacy. The Gregorian Reform goes on to inspire and inform multiple reforms across Europe. This reform was the subject of the First Synod of Cashel. This synod was called by the King of Munster, meaning it was a native Irish reform and not imposed from the outside, and presided over by the first papal legate of Ireland. Its goal was to bring Ireland into conformity with the Gregorian Reform. In addition, it added two elements unique to Irish Christianity. It proclaimed against the marriage of close relatives, was not uncommon at the time. It also granted special status to the Fili, or the poet class. The Fili were placed on par with Clare and continues the ancient Celtic reverence for poets and storytellers. Remember again our paradox of continuity and discontinuity. Seen here is the Rock of Cashel. The buildings in this location date from the 12th century. The Second Synod of Cashel was summoned by Henry II, as mentioned before, King of England. This is not a native reform, but rather imposed from the outside. It sought to establish a regular system of territorial parishes. It legislated the payment of tithes for financial support of the clergy. Whereas the First Synod of Cashel was dealing with the Gregorian Reform, the Second Synod of Cashel can be seen as more of a political move tied in with money and with taxation. The third reform to come to the Irish Church is that of Bernard de Clairvaux and the Cistercians. The Cistercian reform is perhaps the greatest of the monastic reform movements during the Middle Ages, which began at Citeaux Abbey in France. This reform was led by, although not founded by, Bernard de Clairvaux. The ideal was to return to a strict interpretation of the rule of Benedict. The Cistercian order grew rapidly, both in numbers and influence. Within 200 years, they had over 740 communities. Bernard found even Citeaux too moderate, and established a reformed monastery at Clairvaux. Seen here are the two abbeys. On the left, the interior of the excavated and renovated Abbey at Clairvaux, and on the right, an engraving of Citeaux Abbey. This reform comes to the Isles through the figure of Saint Malachy. Malachy was first the Archbishop of Armagh, then Bishop of Down, and makes the pilgrimage with some of his disciples to Rome. It is on this journey that he visited Clairvaux. Several of his Irish disciples remained there. Malachy himself then returns back to Ireland and asks Bernard to send two of the Irish disciples back to bring the Cistercian reform to Ireland. On Bernard's instructions, Malachy acquired a location for a new monastery near Drogheda. In 1142, the first monks from Clairvaux arrived in Ireland, both Irish and French monks. The church at Mellifont was consecrated in 1152, but even before the church was officially consecrated, Mellifont began establishing daughter houses. 6 were established within the first 10 years. Within the next 15 years, the arrival of the Anglo-Normans happened, and they become the dominant power in church and secular affairs. The Life of Malachy by Bernard emphasized that the state of the Irish Church was horrible. This is done in order to augment the image of Malachy and present him as a heroic reformer. From this point on, continental forms of Christianity become increasingly the norm in the Celtic lands, and Norman architecture replaces older Celtic buildings. Seen here are the remains of the guard tower at Mellifont Abbey. Seen here is the cloister arcade. And here's an image of the lavabo at Mellifont. Lavabo being directly translatable into sink. This is a place where priests wash their hands before Mass. Now consider this in contrast to Cormac's Chapel in Cashel and St. Kevin's Chapel. Now these are examples of Irish Romanesque or Irish Norman architecture. Here are more images from the interior of Cormac's Chapel. Note the Latine influence and the Viking motifs which are carved on the sarcophagus above, but also the Roman archetype of the Norman style, both seen in the example above and to the left. Where these reforms leave us is an image of Ireland in drastic change. Seen here is the territories held by the Normans compared to the native Irish. Note how little of Ireland is actually Irish by the turn of the 14th century. With this in mind, we come to the end of Lesson 6. Next time we'll be taking a look at Lesson number 7, Celebrating the Word of God. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.